Hello, welcome to a special Alabama Book Festival edition of Reading for the Rest of Us. First thing you might notice is this is a solo show this week because my co-host, Ashley Gordon, is actually on spring break having a jolly old time somewhere much warmer than where we are now. But we are doing a series of shows in preparation for the Alabama Book Festival, which Troy University is a major sponsor of. The festival will be held April 22nd, 2017 on the grounds of Old Alabama Town at 301 Columbus Street in downtown Montgomery. And we're delighted to welcome, by the magic of Skype, one of the authors who will appear at the festival this year. It's my pleasure to have with us as a guest on the show today, Molly Brodak, who's beaming in from Kennesaw, Georgia. Molly, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
We're delighted to have you. You're actually doing double duty for us this year at the book festival. You're doing a panel on memoir, and you're also going to do a workshop for us on memoir.
Hmm?
Just for folks at home who may not remember this, as part of the festival, we do offer 6 free writing workshops throughout the day, beginning right at 9 o'clock, and Molly's kicking us off at the 9 a.m. hour. And the topics this year are memoir, fiction, young adult fiction, cookbooks and travel writing, and even songwriting, and one on screenwriting. So we have a lot of different varieties. And you can go to www.alabamabookfestival.org and sign up for those workshops. So Molly, we're delighted to have you. One of the reasons I wanted you to come to the book festival this year was because you have written a wonderful memoir called Bandit, A Daughter's Story. And right off the bat, I think the title is fairly self-explanatory, but why don't you give us a quick overview of the book?
Sure. When I was 13 years old, I found out that my dad had spent that previous summer in 1993 robbing banks. And so, that moment when we found out that he'd been committing these crimes, I think a lot of people would feel really shocked or maybe question the truth of that if you found out your dad had been a bank robber. But when we found out, it really made a lot of sense. So that says that my dad had a kind of a criminal past in some ways. He, when he started dating my mom, he didn't tell her that he had a whole other family and a different wife. And so he had a lot of deceit sort of running through his experience as a dad with us and as a partner to my mom. So the book is about what it's like to grow up with a father like that and my experiences of him and my memories. Obviously my difficulties believing or trusting him. And it just sort of tells the story of him and why I think, tries to get to why he committed the crimes he committed. What would cause a sort of average guy to suddenly decide to go rob 10 banks one summer? This is not a spoiler, but I will tell you, I don't really think there's a super clear answer to that, but I try to get at different angles in terms of explaining maybe part of the reasons why that might add up to that.
Sure.
In the book.
The book is a really wonderful meditation on the meaning of family, and I think the longing that we all have for protective parents or parents who look over us, who do what we expect parents to do, be there for us, to be adults. Your father, by any measure, I think, is a very interesting character, and I mean that in the I guess in the literary sense of the word. But I think also, we should mention for readers that he robbed banks in 1994, served 7 years, then was out for 7 years, and then went back on another spree in 2009, and he's currently incarcerated, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. You talk a lot about your father's behavior and trying to get to the essence of him, and one of the things that struck me was he himself had a very, I think, traumatic childhood. Tell us a little bit about his background and where he came from.
Sure, yeah. So my dad, and I didn't know any of this when I was growing up. My dad never talked about it. He never told me where he was from or any of his family history. Um, my dad was born in a Nazi concentration camp, essentially. It was really a labor camp. His family was Polish. They were Polish Catholic, and he had uh, his father's brothers, so his great uncles, were partisans, and so his family was rounded up and brought to a work labor camp and was forced to work. And he had three older siblings who were children at the time, and they all have various memories of this experience. My dad was being carried by his mother in secret in the forced labor camp. His mother was afraid that if she showed that she was pregnant, that they would somehow force her to abort or something would happen to the child. So she kept the pregnancy hidden. My dad was born in 1945, just as they were being liberated, and just as the war was over. So, and then his family really had nowhere to go. They couldn't really go back to Poland. So they planned originally to go to Australia because Australia was sort of giving away land to people who wanted to work it at that time for refugees. And then his father died, and suddenly Australia didn't really want a widow with, 4 kids. So then they were offered a sort of a place to go by a Catholic sponsorship program that brought them to Detroit, which is where they eventually settled. So my dad, his earliest memories are of coming over on a giant, ship to America and learning English. And he was carried under extreme circumstances, in the womb. And part of me thinks that this may have had an effect on his behavior. Of course, he has older siblings, all of whom turned out perfectly normal.
Right.
So I don't know that it's 100%, you can really chalk it up to that. And I know that some of his siblings had maybe even more extreme experiences because they were old enough to remember and to see what was going on around them. And so, they all turned out to live perfectly quiet lives, and none of them have any element of criminality to them. So I struggle with that because part of me thinks that his early years were so dramatic that they must have had some kind of impact on his development. But why did it affect him that way, maybe, and not his siblings? So yeah, it's an interesting story, and I think he was somewhat ashamed of that. He never told me that he was Polish. In fact, he used to tell me he was born in Germany, and he was born in Germany, but he wasn't German. And I think he was a little bit sort of ashamed of the story, even though there's really nothing to be ashamed of. It's an incredible story of survival. So yeah, it's only very recently from talking to some of his relatives that I found all this out.
It's an amazing discovery, and I think it speaks to the kind of secrets, the family secrets that are kept for various reasons. When you were talking about trying to find an explanation for your father's behavior, you really parsed through a lot of different possibilities. The background of his birth, the circumstances there are one explanation. At one point, he sort of claims PTSD because he was in the military in the 60s and I believe saw combat in Vietnam. Your mother has a very different explanation, though, for it. Can we go into that?
Right. So not only did he claim PTSD from his service in Vietnam as his explanation for why, but we all knew that he had a gambling problem as well. My mom knew that. And that was really at the heart of his money problems and why he committed this kind of financially motivated crime. And at one point, I asked my mom, who happens to be a therapist, who happens to specialize in addiction therapy, which seems now looking back on it pretty ironic in a way, that that's what her job was, and she married, essentially an addict. And so I asked her, I said, what do you think about him having PTSD? Or, you would know, you're a therapist and you would be able to maybe assess him. And she said, I'm not really sure. No one really knows. He's kind of a secretive guy, but PTSD, the symptoms of that are really hard to hide if you have it. And I certainly didn't see them, so it didn't seem very likely. But she seems pretty convinced that he's just simply a sociopath, that he just doesn't have the ability to empathize, and he never really cared about his family very much. He took advantage of my mom. He even took advantage of his own daughter, my older sister, in the context of stealing from her, taking advantage of her, lying to her, and manipulating her all the time, which is something that I think does take a special level of pathology to do as a parent to your own child. So her argument that he's a sociopath, I can understand that. I can understand why she'd say that. I'm still not completely sure. Sometimes I think that is, in a way, giving him that label almost an easy way out. I'd like to see that maybe there's just so much complexity to who he is, that giving him a label like that is a little reductive in a way.
Yeah, and I love that moment in the book where you kind of you essentially reject all those sorts of efforts to stamp a single explanation on him. One of the things that really struck me, though, was, and I thought you did this marvelously in the book, was you talk a lot about the setting in which you grew up, which is Detroit there, and your father worked in the auto industry, and I think by any measure some of his crimes are even more inexplicable because he had a fairly well-paying job, and he at one point was allowed to retire after or to be suspended for a year for indulging in his habits. What's the significance of the setting of Detroit? What do you think that adds to your family's story?
Yeah, it adds a lot. I mean, in a way, I think that there's a parallel between the world my dad grew up in, sort of on decline, and my dad's story. There was such a different world in Detroit when my dad moved there as a child. Even in the 50s, Detroit was known for being, the Paris of the Midwest,
Right.
and the downtown was bustling. And where he lived, a section of Detroit that is now gone called Old Pole Town, which is where a lot of the Eastern European immigrants lived, was just a very tight-knit, family-friendly, very religious environment where everyone raised everyone's kids and maintained the traditions of their families, and crime was low. And I remember my dad saying that when he was a child, he never went anywhere where he couldn't hear the church bells ring. He just always felt that presence of that sort of stable environment. And then the 60s happened, and when he was a teenager, it was the 60s. So he saw his world crumble. I mean, he was there during the white flights and the riots in the 60s, and he saw crime and drugs come to his neighborhood, and an influx of other groups that weren't white, Black people and Hispanics, that he saw as being very threatening, and he saw as being people who were only there to destroy their culture.
That chapter you have on Detroit about that transitional period, it really reminded me a lot of Jeffrey Kennedy's Middlesex, kind of capturing that transitional period.
Totally. That's such a great book. Yeah. And so I think that he became a little bit disillusioned, and he definitely lost his center as a person. He became maybe a little bit bitter and cynical. I know that he started gambling when he was a teenager, just among his friends, but I think that must have really felt like just the world was collapsing around him. And on top of that, Then came the 70s, and we all know what happened to American
Right.
manufacturing in the 70s, especially in a place like Detroit. The plants are getting closed and people are getting laid off, and just your whole world starts to crumble. So it was just a slow decline that he was absolutely in place for, to watch, the entire time.
Right.
And that sort of um, parallels the arc of his life, as well as being kind of one long slide into criminality.
Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about your experience writing this memoir. I think you mentioned at one point you had a sort of definite moment where you were traveling through Detroit in late 2012, and you decided you had to tell this story in book form. Uh, for readers out there who are going to discover this book, we should mention, and it's written in 82 separate sections. Some of these chapters are very, very brief, a paragraph, sometimes a sentence, and you can definitely tell that that you're also a poet and that you sort of made your literary bones in poetry, because I think there's a lot of really imagery and just the wonderful sounds that you're able to wring out of sentences. Tell us a little bit about the journey to decide to write this book. I think most people sit there and think, I could never tell my family's story because it's really going to hurt a lot of people. Did you struggle with that as you were putting the book together?
I did, and so I didn't do it for a long time. Um, I think that first of all, I thought that it would be too hard to sort of say the truth, and especially from my own perspective, and not write a biography of my dad, but really talk about what it was like for me to be around him. So I thought it would be too hard. I also thought it wouldn't be interesting for some reason. I just always sort of minimized it in my own mind. And yeah, I did worry about hurting the people in the book who are still all alive.
Yeah.
I remember at one point telling my grandparents that I was going to write this book, and my grandma said, "Can't you just wait until everybody's dead?" and and I thought, like, no way, I really can't wait. I sort of had the impulse to do it, and I needed to do it while I had enough courage.
You talk
So
very early in the book about your discovery of writing and the way that it kind of helped you cope, I think, with your childhood. Tell us a little bit about when you did discover that you were going to be a writer, and because there is that long period before you decide to tell this story.
Right. And so I took a poetry class when I was an undergraduate, and I just decided I wanted to become a writer, and specifically a poet. I think I didn't know that you could be a poet, so it never was sort of presented to me as an option when I was in school.
Right.
And then when I realized you could do that, I thought, well, that's just the best thing. So I went to go get my MFA in poetry, and I really didn't take any fiction classes or other things like that, because I just really wanted to focus on poetry. I think looking back now, I realize I was probably avoiding the story, and I just didn't really want to go there, which I think is a common thing I've heard other people say. When you have a really interesting story, or a life event, you kind of avoid it for a long time.
Right,
So
right.
um, but yeah, I eventually realized that it wasn't going to go away until I dealt with it, and so I had to sit down and write out the book.
Okay. Another thing I love about the book is we leap back and forth in time. We have chapters that are about your memories of certain experiences with your father, and then we come into present day where we're sort of grappling with the conversations with your mother and family, your sister. I'm always curious when we have memoirs like this. Is the book, the layout of the chapters chronologically the way you wrote them, or at what point were you piecing them together?
I wrote them in a very different order, and I wrote them just sort of free associating without any concern for timeline. And so when I was working with my editor at Grove, she really helped me a lot to try to shape it into a slightly more chronological order. I know it's not straightforwardly chronological, but it is generally sort of chronological. Yeah. So she helped me change the order a lot. It was really wild. It was really all over the place when I first wrote it, because I think I just needed to do it that way. I just needed to kind of write things as they came to me and not stress out too much about building a timeline from the initial outset. Also, I think being a poet, you have a mind that maybe leaps a little farther than a fiction writer who's more interested in making sure the plot is linear, you know. So I just sort of use my poetic instincts, and the book still does kind of jump around a little bit, and to some extent I really wanted it to do that a little bit, because I feel like that was an accurate representation of how memory works and how sensation works. It's not very linear, you know.
I think when people read the memoir, they'll discover two very particular ways in which it's apparent that you're a poet. One is you do a lot of sort of meditating on, I think, certain motifs or images, and one of the recurring, I guess, sort of symbols in the book, I'm not sure it's a symbol so much, but there's a lot about animals in this book. I mean, there's a point where you have a whole chapter about singing robins, and then there's a visit to a zoo. And tell us a little bit about where the animals come into the story.
Well, two things. I think the first thing is that I was a very quiet, shy, and lonely child, and I found companionship in animals because they had a kind of, acceptance of you that maybe people don't always offer. And also, I think I felt like there could be kind of an unspoken trust between yourself and an animal in a way that I just couldn't develop as a child. I was not very trusting of people, as you might imagine. So that was one reason I've just sort of always been an animal lover, and I pay a lot of attention to animals when they come into view. And so I'm always hyper aware of birds around me and you know, all kinds of things. The other thing is that I think, as someone who grew up in a sort of difficult family and being the youngest child, sometimes you feel like a creature more than a person, because you're just sort of trapped there. And I think that the zoo metaphor definitely works, because I have memories of childhood where I kind of just felt like I was some kind of creature who needed to be fed and, you know, looked after, and that my parents were the keepers. And you know, that memory of having really no agency as a child was something I wanted to write about, because, you know, I remember what that's like to feel like your parents are in total control of your life. And as you mature as a child, you realize that sometimes your parents aren't perfect people and that they haven't done a very good job of taking care of you at certain times. And that's a really hard thing to like deal with. But I think we all have to come to grips with that at some point.
There's one moment in the book that I think really speaks to anybody who's ever tried or struggled with the idea of whether they have the audacity to write a memoir and be this confessional, because it really is an act of self-exposure. You put yourself at great risk, and it's a scene where you're taking a creative writing class, I believe, up at West Virginia University, and you sort of begin to explore your feelings about your family background. And one of the folks another classmate accuses you of having a pity party. And then you give a whole chapter on the significance of a pity party. That leads me to ask, kind of as a transition into the talking briefly about the workshop that you'll be giving, why do we write memoir? Why is memoir such a popular genre these days?
Well, let me just say, I realize it is popular, and I really love that it is popular, because I think one of the things that people crave in memoir and why it's so popular is that we want techniques. We want to know, how did other people make it? You know, life is hard, and I don't care if you've had a bank robber for a dad or a perfectly nice, normal dad. life is hard. Life is hard for everyone. And I think that we seek information in memoir about how to survive, even normal, boring lives. So I'm really glad that it's popular, and I don't think you need to have a really exotic story in order to write a memoir. I really do believe like everyone should write a memoir because, in a way, it gets you to reflect on yourself that in a certain way that you never could otherwise. So it's a really great experience, and I know it's really scary, but I know that all families have secrets, and I can tell you, as someone who sort of willfully exposed all of her family's secrets, that it is better on this side. It is better having it all out and being able to let go of some of that secret darkness that everybody knows about in families. I don't know a single family that doesn't have some dark secret stuff in there,
Right,
So,
right.
so I think part of it too is, as readers, we want to see someone sort of take that plunge and be brave enough to confess and to say what it's really like to be alive. I think that everybody needs that.
I love what you say about, I love your use of the word technique, because I do think that there is a real life sort of bridge there between literary technique, the devices that those of us who are trained as writers maybe use in writing memoir, and our survival mechanisms. And I think you know exactly what you say about your experience with animals and why they're in the book is a perfect illustration of that. I'd be absolutely remiss if I didn't ask this question. I know your father at some point will be getting will be released, and readers always want to know about the reactions within families to the book. Has he read this book, and has he given you any feedback on it?
I know that he knows about the book. We had to send him kind of a permission form. The lawyers at the publishing house wanted to make sure that he knew about it, so he couldn't sue or anything like that. So I had to ask for his permission to write about him and use his image and his letters, and he gave permission in a kind of just quick, casual way. He didn't really seem upset about the book being written, which surprised me. I thought he would be upset, But has he read it? I don't know. Someone would have had to have sent it to him in prison, and that's possible. I know that his family members, his brothers and sisters, know about it, and I think some of them have even read it. So it's very possible, but I just don't know. I haven't been in contact with him for a while now, so I'm not sure. I would want to read it if it were me.
Yeah.
So I think he will eventually read it if he
I,
hasn't already.
I don't think there's any greater statement of the ties that bind us to our family than the fact that you had to ask your father's permission to essentially write about your relationship with him. It strikes me as that's a perfect example of how we're almost always bound to our family. I want to thank you for being here today. We are running out of time. And just as a reminder to folks out there, Molly will be appearing at the Alabama Book Festival on April 22nd, 2017. She'll be doing both a workshop in memoir writing, where she'll break it down on how to actually put pen to paper, and she'll also be on a panel with another author who's done a memoir. And we look forward to seeing you in Montgomery. And thank you very much for your time, Molly. It's really a wonderful book, and I appreciate you taking the time to be here today.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a week or so with another updated edition of Reading for the Rest of Us and talking about the Alabama Book Festival. Until then, as we always like to say in our goodbyes, read a good book.